The attorney was already seated at my kitchen table when I walked through the door. He had a briefcase open in front of him, papers fanned out like he owned the place. My husband stood by the window with his arms crossed. My son-in-law, my daughter's husband, was leaning against the counter, and my daughter was beside him, not looking at me. I still had my good black coat on, the one I'd worn to bury my father-in-law 3 hours ago. "Close the door, Mom," my daughter said. I did. "We need to talk about the estate," the attorney said. He introduced himself. I didn't catch his name. There was a ringing in my ears that had started at the graveside and hadn't stopped. I sat down across from him because my legs weren't going to hold me much longer. "Mr. Betrayal, Walter Reed's will has been reviewed," he said. "The house and the investment accounts passed to his son." He nodded toward my husband. "The vehicle goes to the estate for liquidation. There is a bequest here for you." He slid a paper across the table. $8,000. For your years of care. I looked at the number. $8,000. I had quit my job at the county school district 11 years ago to move into that house and take care of my father-in-law full-time. 11 years. I was 63 years old, and I had $8,000 and apparently no home. "There's also the matter of the property," the attorney continued. "Since the house transfers in full, we'd ask that you vacate within 60 days. "She's already agreed," my husband said. "We discussed this." I turned and looked at him. We did not discuss this. He didn't look away, but something shifted behind his eyes. "It's what Dad wanted. Can I at least take off my coat?" I said. Nobody answered. "I took off my coat anyway." I want to back up, because if I don't explain how I got to that kitchen table, none of the rest of it makes sense. My name is Bette. I'm 64 now. I was born in Knoxville, Tennessee, moved to Ohio when I was 19 for college, and never quite made it back. I married my husband, I'll call him Roger, when I was 26. He was 30, worked in commercial insurance, steady and quiet and reliable in the way that seemed like enough when you're young. His father, Walter, was a widower by the time I came into the family. His wife had died of a stroke the year before Roger and I met. Walter was a tall, stoic man who'd spent 30 years as a civil engineer and had the hands to prove it. He lived alone in the house he and his late wife had built in 1978, a 4-bedroom colonial in Westerville, just outside Columbus. Big yard, fruit trees in the back, a workshop in the garage where he spent every Saturday morning. Roger was an only child. His parents had wanted more, but it hadn't worked out that way. So it was just the 3 of us, plus my daughter Angie from my first marriage, who was 10 when Roger and I wed and who grew up calling Walter Grandpa Walt, even though he technically wasn't. For the first 15 years, things were fine. Walter drove himself, managed his own finances, came to Thanksgiving. He was private, but not cold. We had a rhythm. Then the Parkinson's diagnosis came when Walter was 78. In the beginning, it was small things. A tremor in his right hand. Trouble with buttons. He stopped driving himself after he clipped a mailbox on Morse Road and sat in the car for 20 minutes before he called Roger. He didn't tell me about it himself. That was Walter. He'd absorb everything internally and only let it out sideways. Roger's solution was immediate and non-negotiable in the way he presented it. His father would move in with us. "Of course," I said, "because what else do you say? He was family." And I was a retired school administrator with more time than Roger, who traveled 4 days out of 7 for work. Someone had to be there. We converted our downstairs office into a bedroom. We installed grab bars in the hall bathroom. I researched Parkinson's disease the way I used to research curriculum proposals. Thoroughly, methodically, probably more than was good for me at 2 in the morning. Walter moved in on a Tuesday in March. He brought 4 boxes, his recliner, and a photograph of his late wife that he put on the nightstand and never once moved. I cooked his meals and managed his medication schedule. I drove him to the neurologist in Dublin every 6 weeks and to the general practitioner monthly. I learned to spot the difference between a good morning and a hard morning by the sound of his footsteps in the hall. Hard mornings, I'd start coffee earlier and set his chair closer to the counter so he didn't have to reach. In year 3, he started having trouble swallowing. We modified his diet. I learned to prepare foods the right texture, soft enough to manage, real enough to feel like a meal and not a punishment. He'd been a meat and potatoes man his whole life, and I was not going to start serving him applesauce and call it dinner. So we figured it out together. That was the thing that surprised me about Walter. One-on-one, away from Roger, he was different. Quieter in a softer way. He'd sit at the kitchen table while I cooked, and sometimes he'd talk about the highway interchange he'd designed in 1983, about a fishing trip to Lake Erie when Roger was 12. About the way his wife used to hang the laundry even when they had a dryer because she said clothes smelled better that way. I'd listen and stir whatever was on the stove, and those hours were, genuinely, some of the most peaceful of my later life. He called me Bette in those moments. Not Roger's wife, not dear, Bette. Roger, meanwhile, was home on weekends and on his phone most of those. He'd look in on his father, pat him on the shoulder, ask how he was doing. Walter would say, fine. Roger would say, could. And that was that. I don't think Roger was a bad man. I think he genuinely believed that arranging for his father to be cared for was the same thing as caring for his father. A lot of people make that mistake. Angie, my daughter, lived 40 minutes away in Hilliard with her husband, a man I'll call Derek. Derek was in real estate and had opinions about everything, and skin too thin for most of them. Angie visited occasionally, brought flowers, stayed 90 minutes. I never asked her to do more. She had 2 young kids and a full life. But Derek had started making remarks at family dinners about property values and what happens to the house eventually in a way that made my stomach clench. I filed it away and kept cooking. In year 7, Walter had a fall. Nothing broken, but it was the kind of fall that changes the math. After that, he needed more direct help. Bathing, dressing, transfers from the bed. I hired a home health aide for weekday mornings, a woman named, well, I called her my Tuesday miracle because she showed up every week without fail and had the gentlest hands I'd ever seen. Roger paid for it without complaint. I'll give him that. But the rest was still me. Nights when Walter called out. Nights when his medication timing was off and he couldn't settle. Nights when I sat outside his door on the hallway floor at 2 a.m. just to be close enough to hear him breathe. I told Roger about those nights. He said I should wake him up. I never did, because waking Roger meant explaining, and explaining at 2 a.m. meant both of us being awake. And then nobody slept and nothing got better. So I just did it. Year 9, Walter's cognition started to slip. Not dramatically at first, more like a radio losing its signal. He'd ask me the same question twice in an hour. He'd call me by his late wife's name sometimes, then catch himself and look embarrassed. I always said, it's Bette, but that's okay, and moved on, because it was okay. It really was. But sometimes, on clear days, he'd look at me with his full self behind his eyes and say something that stayed with me. One afternoon, about 8 months before he died, we were sitting on the back porch watching the leaves come down off the maple. And he said, "You know, I didn't make this easy for you. You've been fine." I said, "I haven't." He was quiet for a moment. "Roger doesn't see it. He's like me. We see what we want to be true." He looked at the maple tree. "You've given up a lot." I didn't answer because there wasn't an answer that was both honest and kind, and I'd made a habit of trying to be both. "I'm going to make it right," he said. I assumed he meant in some general way. People say things like that. I didn't ask him to elaborate. He died on a Thursday morning in November. Peacefully, in the hospital bed we'd moved into the downstairs room 8 months prior. The hospice nurse was there. I was there. Roger came home from Cincinnati that afternoon. He'd driven 3 hours the moment I called, to his credit, but Walter was already gone by then. I held Walter's hand until it went cold, and then I went and sat in the kitchen and drank coffee and didn't cry until much later. The funeral was Monday, and Monday evening was when I came home to the attorney at my kitchen table. I sat there and listened to the whole explanation. $8,000. 60 days to vacate. Roger had already spoken to an attorney, apparently. This one. The papers were already drafted. There was a version of Walter's will dated 3 years back, and a codicil added 14 months ago that redirected the house solely to Roger. I didn't know about the codicil. I said, Dad had the right to update his will. Roger said, It's his property. I'm aware of that. I kept my voice level. I'd like to see a copy of the documents. The attorney slid them across. I read every page while the three of them sat there. Roger. Angie, who was looking at the floor. Derek, who was looking at his phone. I read slowly. I have reading glasses now, and I wasn't going to rush for anyone's comfort. The codicil was valid on its face. Walter had signed it. There was a notary stamp. The date checked out. $8,000. 60 days. I stacked the papers and slid them back. I'll need copies, I said. Of course, the attorney said. He was professional, I'll give him that. He was doing his job. I looked at Roger. He'd uncrossed his arms. I know this is hard, he said. But Dad was very clear. Where will you live? I asked him. He blinked. Here. This is my house now. Right. I stood up, picked up my coat from the chair, and walked to the bedroom to start thinking. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I'd been managing hard mornings for 11 years. I knew how to absorb and regroup. What I did do, first thing Tuesday morning, was call in a state attorney. Her name was... Well, she mattered enough to me that I'm going to just call her my attorney, because she became important to this story, and I don't want to reduce her to a prop. She came recommended by a woman in my church small group whose husband had died the previous year and who said, Call her before you do anything else. So I did. We met in her office in Worthington on a gray Tuesday morning. I brought the copies of the will, the codicil, 11 years of documentation I had kept, medical appointment logs, medication records, expense spreadsheets, notes from the home health aide, and 2 cups of coffee, one for each of us. She read everything, asked questions. I answered them. Then she said, Tell me about the codicil. Were you present when it was signed? No. I didn't know it existed. When was Walter's cognitive decline documented as significant? I pulled out the neurologist's notes. The formal notation of mild cognitive impairment was dated 18 months before the codicil, which didn't mean he lacked capacity at the time of signing. People with MCI can still have legal capacity, but it was worth examining. I'll need to request the drafting attorney's file, she said. The circumstances of signing, whether Walter initiated it or whether someone prompted him. I already had a guess about that. She also walked me through something I hadn't known. Ohio marital property law. Roger and I were still married. The house had been owned by Walter, not by us. So it wasn't marital property, but certain decisions made during the marriage, including my unpaid caregiving, could be relevant in divorce proceedings, not to the house itself, but to other marital assets. I sat with that for a moment. I haven't filed for divorce, I said. I know, she said. I'm just making sure you understand the full picture. The full picture was this. I had documentation of 11 years of unpaid labor with quantifiable market value. The average annual cost of full-time professional home care in Ohio runs between $40,000 and $60,000 a year. I had done that work for 11 years. The math was not subtle. Also, she said, leaning back, I want to ask you something. Did Walter ever give you anything directly? Any documents, Any personal effects? Anything in writing? I thought about the back porch. The maple tree. I'm going to make it right. He gave me something before he went to hospice, I said slowly. A card. In an envelope. I haven't opened it. She looked at me steadily. Do you still have it? It was in my coat pocket. I put it there the morning Walter asked me to take it, and I'd been wearing that coat to appointments, and to the grocery store, and to his funeral, and it had sat in my pocket through all of it. I reached in and put it on her desk. She didn't touch it. That's yours. You should open it when you're ready. But if there's anything in writing from Walter, anything, it matters. I drove home, sat in my car in the driveway, and opened the envelope. Inside was a card. One of those simple cream cards from a box, the kind you buy at the drugstore. Walter's handwriting, which had been deteriorating for 2 years, was still recognizable. Shaky, but deliberate, like he'd taken his time. Bette. The house was never the point. I asked Tom Gallagher to handle the rest. He has instructions. I'm sorry it took me this long to say so. Walt Tom Gallagher. I sat there for a long moment. Then I went inside, made coffee, and called my attorney. Tom Gallagher, it turned out, was Walter's original attorney. Not the one at my kitchen table on Monday, but the one Walter had worked with for 30 years. A semi-retired man in his 70s who worked out of a small office in Gahanna, and who, when my attorney contacted his office, confirmed that yes, he was expecting to hear from someone regarding the Reed estate. Walter had established a revocable living trust 4 years prior. The trust held a separate investment account Walter had maintained independently, a collection of index funds and a portion of a pension payout he'd taken as a lump sum years ago. The trust named me as sole beneficiary. The total value just under $340,000. He had also, through Tom Gallagher's office, drafted a personal letter to accompany the trust documents. 3 pages typed. Walter had dictated it to Tom's paralegal, because by that point his hands couldn't manage more than a few lines. It laid out, in Walter's own words, what I had done for him over the course of 11 years. It read like testimony, like he'd been composing it in his head for a long time and finally had the chance to say it. He described specific things, the texture modified meals, the 3 a.m. floor sitting, the way I'd learned to read his hard mornings. He wrote about the conversation on the back porch. He wrote, "My son arranged for his father's care. Bette provided it. Those are not the same thing, and I want that on record." I read that line 3 times. I did not give the $340,000 to charity. I want to be clear about that, because I've heard too many of these stories end that way, and I was 63 years old with no pension of my own, having left that job at the school district before I'd fully vested. I needed that money. I kept it, put the majority into an annuity, and used a portion to secure an apartment in a 55-plus community in New Albany while the rest of the estate situation resolved. My attorney filed a challenge to the codicil based on the circumstances of signing. Walter's neurologist provided documentation about his cognitive status during that period. The original estate attorney, the one at my kitchen table, had to produce his drafting file, which showed that the appointment to sign the codicil had been scheduled by Roger, not by Walter, and that Walter had arrived with Roger present rather than alone. That didn't invalidate the codicil automatically, but it created enough of a legal question that Roger's attorney recommended a settlement. Roger kept the house. The $8,000 bequest was renegotiated upward significantly as part of the marital settlement. Because I also filed for divorce, and 11 years of documented caregiving weighed something in an Ohio court. I don't think Roger is a villain. I've had a lot of time to sit with this and I keep coming back to that. He convinced himself that what he wanted was also what his father wanted, and he found an attorney willing to help him act on it quickly before anyone could look too carefully. He wasn't scheming so much as he was just looking away. He'd been doing that for years. looking away from the hard mornings, from the 3 a.m. hallway floor, from the 11 years of labor that kept his father in his own home until the end. Some people look away long enough that they forget there's anything to look at. Angie and I had a hard year. She'd known about Derek's involvement in pushing Roger toward the codicil. Derek had suggested the idea, apparently, after one of his property values dinner conversations, and she'd stayed quiet about it. We've talked since. We're careful with each other now in the way you are with something that healed but left a scar. I don't know yet if that's enough. I think maybe it is. I moved into my apartment in April. It's small. 2 bedrooms, one of which I've turned into an office. I have a balcony that looks out at a small pond, and I drink my coffee there in the mornings when the weather allows. I joined a grief support group, not for Walter specifically, but for the general accumulation of things I'd been carrying and setting down in hallways at 2 a.m. for too many years. A woman in the group told me I should write it all down. Not for anyone else, she said. Just so you have a record that it happened. That you did those things and they were real. So I'm writing it down. I spent 11 years caring for a man who wasn't my father in a house that wasn't mine, watched by a husband who called it handled. Walter knew what that was. He'd been watching the whole time from his recliner and his hard mornings and his shaky handwriting. He saw me. He just took longer than I would have liked to say so. But he said so. That's the thing I come back to, on the balcony with my coffee, watching the light come up over the pond. He saw me, and in the end, he made it matter. Not perfectly. Not without legal fees and hard conversations and a year of feeling like the floor had gone out from under everything I thought I'd built. But he made it matter. I keep the card in the drawer of my nightstand. The house was never the point. I'm sorry it took me this long to say so. It wasn't the house. It was never the house. It was the 11 years and the fact that one person, at least, knew exactly what they had cost me and made sure I knew that he knew. That turned out to be enough. I think about Walter's hands a lot. By the end, they shook so badly he couldn't button his own shirts. But when he wrote that card, the house was never the point. I'm sorry it took me this long to say so. Every word was deliberate. He chose to spend whatever steadiness he had left on telling the truth. That's not a small thing. That's a man deciding, at the very end, what kind of person he wanted to have been. I spent a long time wondering if I'd been foolish. 11 years is not nothing. I gave up a career, a pension, the kind of financial footing that takes decades to build and disappears faster than you'd think. People have asked me, kindly, carefully, whether I regret it. And the honest answer is, I don't regret caring for Walter. I regret assuming that doing the right thing would protect me from having to fight for myself afterward. Those are 2 different regrets, and only one of them is mine to carry. What Walter understood and what I've come to understand is that how we treat people when it costs us something is the only measure of character that actually matters. Not intention. Not sentiment. Not the story we tell ourselves at Thanksgiving, what we do on the hard mornings when nobody is watching and there's no reward on the horizon. That's who we are. Walter saw that in me. He also, to his credit, finally saw it in himself. And he did something about it. The practical part of this. Hiring an attorney, pulling together 11 years of documentation, understanding Ohio trust law well enough to ask the right questions. That wasn't something that came naturally to me. I'm not a litigious person. I don't enjoy conflict. But I have learned at 63 that clarity is not the same thing as aggression. Understanding your own situation clearly, knowing what you're owed and what tools exist to pursue it, is not a betrayal of your values. It is the application of them. I kept those records because I was organized, not because I expected to need them in a courtroom. But when I did need them, they were there. Preparation and integrity turned out to be the same muscle. And then there was the part that required me to simply keep going when I didn't know how it would end. The 60 days notice. The apartment search. The first meeting with my attorney when I still wasn't sure any of this was worth fighting. There's a particular kind of endurance that has nothing dramatic about it. It's just deciding one morning at a time to stay in the room and keep asking questions. That's what got me through. Not certainty, not courage in the movie sense, just a refusal to stop moving. I'm on my balcony most mornings now, coffee going, watching the light come up over the pond. It's quiet in a way I didn't know I was missing. I think about Walter sometimes, his recliner, his hard mornings, the photograph of his wife that never moved from the nightstand. I think about the version of this story where I never opened that card, never called an attorney, just took the $8,000 in the 60 days and told myself that was all I could do. I'm glad I'm not living that version. The card is still in my nightstand drawer. Some nights I don't think about it at all. Some nights I open the drawer just to confirm it's there, that the whole thing was real, that someone saw it, that the record exists. It does. It always will.